Making Music Together, A Study in Social Relationship by Alfred Schütz. 1. Music is a meaningful context which is not bound to a conceptual scheme. Yet this meaningful context can be communicated. The process of communication between composer and listener normally requires an intermediary, an individual performer or a group of coperformers. Among all these participants, there prevail social relations of a highly complicated structure. To analyze certain elements of this structure is the purpose of this paper. The discussion is not aimed at problems commonly relegated to the realm of the so-called sociology of music, although it is believed that an investigation of the social relationships among the participants in the musical process is a prerequisite for any research in this field. Nor is it concerned with a phenomenology of musical experience, although some elementary observations regarding the structure of music will have to be made. The chief interest of our analysis consists in the particular character of all social interactions connected with the musical process. They are doubtless meaningful to the actor as well as to the addressee, but this meaning structure is not capable of being expressed in conceptual terms. They are founded upon communication, but not primarily upon a semantic system used by the communicator as a scheme of expression and by his partner as a scheme of interpretation. For this very reason, it can be hoped that a study of the social relationships connected with the musical process may lead to some insights valid for many other forms of social intercourse, perhaps even to illumination of a certain aspect of the structure of social interaction as such that has not so far attracted from social scientists the attention it deserves. This introductory statement requires some clarification. When sociologists speak of social interaction, they usually have in mind a set of interdependent actions of several human beings, mutually related by the meaning which the actor bestows upon his action, and which he supposes to be understood by his partner. To use Max Weber's terminology, these actions have to be oriented in their course with reference to one another. In studying the process of communication as such, most sociologists have taken as a model either the interplay of significative gestures or language in the broadest sense of this term. G.H. Mead, for example, finds that two wrestlers communicate with each other by a conversation of gestures, which enables either of the participants to anticipate the other's behavior and to orient his own behavior by means of such anticipation. Footnote: G.H. Mead, Mind, Self, and Society, Chicago, 1937. We may also say that two chess players who both know the functional significance of each chessman in general, as well as within the unique concrete constellation at any given moment of a particular game, communicate their thoughts to each other in terms of the vocabulary and syntax of the scheme of expression and interpretation common to both of them, which is determined by the body of the rules of the game. In the case of ordinary speech or the use of written symbols, it is assumed that each partner interprets his own behavior as well as that of the other in conceptual terms which can be translated and conveyed to the other partner by way of a common semantic system. In any of these cases, the existence of a semantic system, be it the conversation of significant gestures, the rules of the game, or language proper, is simply presupposed as something given from the outset, and the problem of significance remains unquestioned. The reason for this is quite clear. In the social world into which we are born, language, in the broadest sense, is admittedly the paramount vehicle of communication. Its conceptual structure and its power of typification make it the outstanding tool for the conveying of meaning. There is even a strong tendency in contemporary thought to identify meaning with its semantic expression and to consider language, speech, symbols, significant gestures as the fundamental condition of social intercourse as such. Even Mead's highly original endeavor to explain the origin of language by an interplay of significant gestures, his famous example of the dogfight, starts from the supposition that a pre-linguistic conversation of attitudes is possible. It is not necessary to adapt Mead's basic position of social behaviorism in order to admit that, as has so often happened, he has seen a crucial problem more clearly than others. Nevertheless, the solution he offers only seemingly removes the difficulties connected with the basic issue, namely whether the communicative process is really the foundation of all possible social relationships, or whether, on the contrary, all communication presupposes the existence of some kind of social interaction which, though it is an indispensable condition of all possible communication, does not enter the communicative process and is not capable of being grasped by it. It is currently rather fashionable to dismiss problems of this kind with a haughty reference to the question of the priority of the chicken or the egg. Such an attitude not only reflects an unfamiliarity with the philosophical issue discussed by the schoolmen under the heading of priority, but also constitutes a self-made obstacle to a serious analysis of the various problems of foundation important especially for the social sciences. As far as the question under scrutiny is concerned, the concrete researches of many sociologists and philosophers have aimed at certain forms of social intercourse which necessarily precede all communication. Wiese's contact situations, Shaler's perceptual theory of the alter ego, to a certain extent Cooley's concept of the face-to-face relationship, Malinowski's interpretation of speech as originating within the situation determined by social interaction, Sartre's basic concept of looking at the other and being looked at by the other, le regard. All these are just a few examples of the endeavor to investigate what might be called the mutual tuning-in relationship, upon which alone all communication is founded. It is precisely this mutual tuning-in relationship by which the I and the thou are experienced by both participants as a we in vivid presence. Instead of entering here into the complicated philosophical analysis of this problem, footnote, Mead's Philosophy of the Present, Chicago, 1932, is just one example of how investigations of this kind have to be carried out and where they lead. It may be permissible to refer to a series of well-known phenomena in the social world in which this pre-communicative social relationship comes to the foreground. Mead's example of wrestlers has already been mentioned. It is typical for a set of similar interrelated activities, such as the relationship between pitcher and catcher, tennis players, fencers, and so on. We find the same features in marching together, dancing together, making love together, or making music together, and this last-named activity will serve as an example for analysis in the following pages. It is hoped that this analysis will in some measure contribute to clarification of the structure of the mutual tuning-in relationship, which originates in the possibility of living together simultaneously in specific dimensions of time. It is also hoped that the study of the particular communicative situation within the musical process will shed some light on the non-conceptual aspect involved in any kind of communication. 2. Certain elements of the social structure of the musical process were analyzed in one of the later writings of the famous French sociologist Maurice Halbwachs. Footnote, Maurice Halbwachs, La mémoire collective chez les musiciens, in Revue philosophique, March to April 1939. The paper in question deserves special attention because it was written as a kind of introduction to a major study on the nature of time, which was unfortunately never completed owing to the author's tragic death in the concentration camp of Buchenwald in July 1944. Footnote, 4 chapters from the manuscript were published posthumously under the title Mémoires et Société in l'année sociologique, 3rd series, Volume 1, Paris, 1949. Halbwachs's basic position is well known. He assumed that all kinds of memory are determined by a social framework and that individual memory cannot be conceived of without the assumption of a collective memory from which all individual recollection derives. This basic principle, which it is not our concern to criticize here, was applied to the problem of musical communication because the author felt that the very structure of music, its development within the flux of time, its detachment from anything that lasts, its realization by recreation, offers an excellent opportunity for demonstrating that there is no other possibility of preserving a set of recollections with all their shades and details except by recourse to the collective memory. In other words, Halbwachs was primarily concerned with analyzing the social structure of music. Curiously enough, he divided the realm of music into 2 distinct parts: music as experienced by the educated musician and music as experienced by the layman. With regard to the former, Halbwachs came to the conclusion that it is first of all the possibility of translating music into visual symbols, that is, the system of musical notation, which makes transmission of music possible. To be sure, the signs of musical notation are not images of the sounds. They are, however, means of expressing in a conventional language all the commands which the musician must obey if he wants to reproduce a piece of music properly. The conventional character of the signs of musical notation and their combination consists in the fact that they have meaning merely by continuous reference to the group which invented and adopted them. This group, the Society of Educated Musicians, lives in a world exclusively filled with sounds and is interested in nothing else but creating or listening to a combination of sounds. Even the invention of new combinations of sounds is possible only within the framework of the socially conditioned musical language, which for Halbwachs was identical with the system of musical notation. The creative act of the composer is merely a discovery in the same world of sounds that is accessible exclusively to the society of musicians. It is precisely because the composer accepts the conventions of this society, and because he penetrates more deeply into them than others, that he can make his discoveries. The musical language is not an instrument invented afterward in order to put down and to transmit to other musicians what one of them has spontaneously invented. On the contrary, it is this very language which creates music. This is roughly Halbwachs's main argument for the social character of the musician's music. Yet the child or the musically uneducated person learns nursery rhymes, anthems, popular songs, dance or march melodies by rote without any knowledge of musical notation. How is this possible, and how can this kind of memory for sound combinations be referred to the collective memory? Halbwachs's answer is that the layman's memory of musical events is also founded upon the collective memory, but always attached to meta-musical experiences. Footnote: this term is not used by Halbwachs, but probably renders what he meant. The melody of a song is remembered because the words, a social product, are remembered. As for dances or marches or other pieces of music dissociated from words, it is the rhythm of marching, dancing, speaking, that serves as the carrier of the musical recollection. Yet rhythm does not exist in nature. It too is a result of our living in society. The insulated individual could not discover rhythm. No evidence is offered for the statement, which I believe to be wrong, except reference to the rhythmical character of work songs and of our speech. Both words and rhythms are of social origin, and so consequently are the layman's musical experiences. But they refer to a world in which other than exclusively sonorous events exist, and to a society not exclusively interested in musical texture. So much for Halbwachs. Interesting as Halbwachs's analysis is, it suffers from various shortcomings. In the first place, it seems to me that the distinction between a musician's music and music accessible to the layman is without any foundation in fact. But postponing the discussion of this question and restricting ourselves for the time being to the province of music allegedly accessible only to the educated musician, the following objections to Halbwachs's theory must be raised. 1. He identifies the musical thought with its communication. 2. He identifies musical communication with musical language, which to him is the system of musical notation. 3. He identifies musical notation with the social background of the musical process. In regard to the first objection, it is clear that from the point of view of the composer, a musical thought may be conceived without any intention of communication. This thought may be a perfect piece of music, having its specific meaning structure. It may be remembered at will without being translated into actual sounds or into the visible form of notation. This is, of course, not a particularity of the musical process. It has been said that Raphael would have been one of the greatest painters even if he had been born without arms. In general, all kinds of mental activities performed in fantasy may be perfectly meaningful and capable of being mentally reproduced within the solitude of the individual consciousness. All our unexpressed thoughts, our daydreams, as well as projects for future action never carried out, show these features. But any kind of communication between man and his fellow man, and therefore the communication of musical thoughts, presupposes an event, or a series of events in the outer world, which functions, on the one hand, as a scheme of expression of the communicator's thought, and, on the other hand, as a scheme of interpretation of such thought by the addressee. Musical thoughts can be transmitted to others either by the mechanics of audible sound or by the symbols of musical notation. It is hard to understand why Halbwachs regarded only the latter as the appropriate form of musical communication. Obviously, he took as a model of his analysis the situation in which the composer has to communicate his musical idea to the performer by way of a system of visible signs before the performer can translate these ideas into sounds to be grasped by the listener. But this procedure has nothing to do with the particularities of musical communication as such. It is a more or less technical question. We may perfectly well understand an improvisation executed by one or several instrumentalists, or we may, with Tovey, foresee a revolution in the process of musical communication by means of the microscopic study of phonographic records. There is nothing to prevent the individual production of music directly in terms of the phonographic needle. That is to say, the composer, untrammeled by the technique of instruments, will prescribe all producible timbre in whatever pitches and rhythms he pleases, and will have no more direct cooperation with the craftsman who models the phonographic wavelines than the violinist may with Stradivarius. Footnote, Donald Francis Tovey, Music, in the British Encyclopedia, 14th edition. Musical notation is, therefore, just one among several vehicles of communicating musical thought. But musical notation is by no means identical with musical language. Its semantic system is of quite another kind than that of ideograms, letters, or mathematical or chemical symbols. The ideogram refers immediately to the represented concept, and so does the mathematical or chemical symbol. The written word in our alphabetic languages refers to the sound of the spoken word, and through it as an intermediary to the concept it conveys. As stated above, the meaning of a musical process cannot be related to a conceptual scheme, and the particular function of musical notation today, as well as in its historical development, reflects this situation. The musical sign is nothing but instruction to the performer to produce by means of his voice or his instrument a sound of a particular pitch and duration, giving in addition, at certain historical periods, suggestions as to tempo, dynamics, and expression, or directions as to the connection with other sounds, by such devices as ties, slurs, and the like. All these elements of the tonal material can only be approximately prescribed, and the way to obtain the indicated effect is left to the performer. The composer's specific indications are themselves not always a part of his original creation, but rather one musician's message to another about it. A hint about how to secure in performance a convincing transmission of the work's feeling content without destroying its emotional and intellectual community, says a well-known composer and critic. Footnote, Virgil Thompson, The Art of Judging Music, New York, 1948. And the conductor, Furtwängler, is certainly right in stating that the composer's text cannot give any indication as to the really intended volume of a forte, the really intended speed of a tempo, since every forte and every tempo has to be modified in practice in accordance with the place of the performance and the setting and the strength of the performing group, and that the expression marks have intentionally a merely symbolic value with respect to the whole work, and are not intended to be valid for the single instrument, wherefore a fortissimo for the bassoon has quite another meaning than for the trombone. Footnote, Wilhelm Furtwängler, Interpretation eine musikalische Schicksalsfrage, in Das Atlantisbuch der Musik, Zurich, 1934. Thus, all musical notation remains of necessity vague and open to manifold interpretations, and it is up to the reader or performer to decipher the hints in the score and to define the approximations. These limits vary widely in the course of the historical development of musical culture. The more closely we approach the present in the study of the history of music, the lower the level of the general musical culture of performers and of listeners, and the stronger the tendency of the composer to make his system of notation as exact and precise as possible. That is, to limit more and more the performer's freedom of interpretation. To be sure, all signs of musical notation are conventional, but as has been shown, the system of musical notation is more or less accidental to the process of musical communication. A social theory of music, therefore, does not have to be founded on the conventional character of the visual signs, but rather on the sum total of what we have just called musical culture, against the background of which the reader's or performer's interpretation of these signs takes place. 3. To make this web of social relationships called musical culture clearer, let us imagine a lonely performer of a piece of music sitting at his piano before the score of a sonata by a minor master of the 19th century, which, we assume, is entirely unknown to him. Furthermore, we assume that our piano player is equally proficient as a technician and sight reader, and that, consequently, no mechanical or other external obstacle will hinder the flux of his performance. Yet, having hardly made these two assumptions, we hesitate. Are they indeed compatible with each other? Can we really maintain that the sonata in question is entirely unknown to our performer? He could not be an accomplished technician and sight reader without having attained a certain level of musical culture enabling him to read offhand a piece of music of the type of that before him. Consequently, although this particular sonata and perhaps all the other works of this particular composer might be unknown to him, he will nevertheless have a well-founded knowledge of the type of musical form called sonata within the meaning of 19th century piano music, of the type of themes and harmonies used in such compositions of that period, of the expressional contents he may expect to find in them, in sum, of the typical style in which music of this kind is written, and in which it has to be executed. Even before starting to play or to read the first chord, our musician is referred to a more or less clearly organized, more or less coherent, more or less distinct set of his previous experiences, which constitute in their totality a kind of pre-knowledge of the piece of music at hand. To be sure, this pre-knowledge refers merely to the type to which this individual piece of music belongs, and not to its particular and unique individuality. But the player's general pre-knowledge of its typicality becomes the scheme of reference for his interpretation of its particularity. This scheme of reference determines, in a general way, the player's anticipations of what he may or may not find in the composition before him. Such anticipations are more or less empty. They may be fulfilled and justified by the musical events he will experience when he starts to play the sonata, or they may explode and be annihilated. In more general terms, the player approaching a so-called unknown piece of music does so from a historically, in one's own case autobiographically, determined situation, determined by his stock of musical experiences at hand insofar as they are typically relevant to the anticipated novel experience before him. Footnote: all this is by no means limited to the situation under scrutiny. Indeed, our analysis has so far been merely an application of Husserl's masterful investigations into the structure of our experience. According to him, the factual world is always experienced as a world of pre-constituted types. To embark upon the importance of this discovery by Husserl, especially for the concept of type, so fundamental for all social sciences, is not within the scope of the present paper. This theory has been touched upon in Husserl's Ideas, General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology, translated by W.R. Boyce Gibson, London, New York, 1931, and has been fully developed in his Erfahrung und Urteil, Prague, 1939. This stock of experiences refers indirectly to all his past and present fellow men whose acts or thoughts have contributed to the building up of his knowledge. This includes what he has learned from his teachers, and his teachers from their teachers, what he has taken in from other players' execution, and what he has appropriated from the manifestations of the musical thought of the composer. Thus, the bulk of musical knowledge, as of knowledge in general, is socially derived, and within this socially derived knowledge there stands out the knowledge transmitted from those upon whom the prestige of authenticity and authority has been bestowed, that is, from the great masters among the composers and the acknowledged interpreters of their work. Musical knowledge transmitted by them is not only socially derived, it is also socially approved. Footnote: with regard to the concepts of socially derived and socially approved knowledge, see my paper, The Well-Informed Citizen, in Social Research, Volume 13, Number 4, December 1946. Being regarded as authentic and therefore more qualified to become a pattern for others than knowledge originating elsewhere. 4. In the situation we have chosen to investigate, the actual performance of a piece of music, the genesis of the stock of knowledge at hand with all its hidden social references is, so to speak, prehistoric. The web of socially derived and socially approved knowledge constitutes merely the setting for the main social relationship into which our piano player, and also any listener or mere reader of music, will enter, that with the composer of the sonata before him. It is the grasping of the composer's musical thought and its interpretation by recreation which stand in the center of the player's field of consciousness, or, to use a phenomenological term, which become thematic for his ongoing activity. This thematic kernel stands out against the horizon of pre-acquired knowledge, which knowledge functions as a scheme of reference and interpretation for the grasping of the composer's thought. It is now necessary to describe the structure of this social relationship between composer and beholder. But before entering into its analysis, it might be well to forestall a possible misunderstanding. It is by no means our thesis that a work of music, or of art in general, cannot be understood except by reference to its individual author or to the circumstances, biographical or other, in which he created this particular work. It is certainly not a prerequisite for the understanding of the musical content of the so-called Moonlight Sonata to take cognizance of the silly anecdotes which popular belief attaches to the creation of this work. It is not even indispensable to know that the sonata was composed by a man called Beethoven, who lived then and there, and went through such and such personal experiences. Footnote: the term beholder shall include the player, listener, and reader of music. Any work of art, once accomplished, exists as a meaningful entity independent of the personal life of its creator. Footnote: this problem has been discussed for the realm of poetry by E.M.W. Tilliard and C.S. Lewis in their witty and profound book, The Personal Heresy, A Controversy, London, New York, 1939. The social relationship between composer and beholder, as it is understood here, is established exclusively by the fact that a beholder of a piece of music participates in and to a certain extent recreates the experiences of the, let us suppose, anonymous fellow man who created this work, not only as an expression of his musical thoughts, but with communicative intent. For our purposes, a piece of music may be defined, footnote, an excellent survey of philosophical theories of music can be found in Suzanne K. Langer, Philosophy in a New Key, Cambridge 1942, Chapter 8, On Significance in Music, and Chapter 9, The Genesis of Artistic Import, although the author's own position seems unsatisfactory. It may be summed up in the following quotation. Music has all the earmarks of a true symbolism except one, the existence of an assigned connotation. It is a limited idiom like an artificial language, only even less successful, for music at its highest, though clearly a symbolic form, is an unconsummated symbol. Articulation is its life but not assertion, expressiveness, not expression. Very roughly and tentatively indeed, as a meaningful arrangement of tones in inner time. It is the occurrence in inner time, Bergson's durée, which is the very form of existence of music. The flux of tones unrolling in inner time is an arrangement meaningful to both the composer and the beholder, because and insofar as it evokes, in the stream of consciousness participating in it, an interplay of recollections, retentions, protensions, and anticipations which interrelate the successive elements. To be sure, the sequence of tones occurs in the irreversible direction of inner time, in the direction, as it were, from the first bar to the last. But this irreversible flux is not irretrievable. The composer, by the specific means of his art, footnote, some of these specific means are essential to any kind of music. Others belong merely to a particular musical culture. Rhythm, melody, tonal harmony, technique of diminution, and the so-called forms based on what Tovey calls the larger harmony, such as sonata, rondo, variations, and so on, are certainly characteristic of the musical culture of the 19th century. It may be hoped that intensified research in the phenomenology of musical experience will shed some light upon the difficult problem which of these means of meaningful arrangement of tones is essential to music in general, regardless of what its particular historical setting may be. Has arranged it in such a way that the consciousness of the beholder is led to refer to what he actually hears, to what he anticipates will follow, and also to what he has just been hearing, and what he has heard ever since this piece of music began. The hearer, therefore, listens to the ongoing flux of music, so to speak, not only in the direction from the first to the last bar, but simultaneously in a reverse direction back to the first one. Footnote. This insight has been formulated in an unsurpassable way by St. Augustine in Book 11, Chapter 38 of his Confessions. It is essential for our problem to gain a clearer understanding of the time dimension in which music occurs. It was stated above that the inner time, the durée, is the very form of existence of music. Of course, playing an instrument, listening to a record, reading a page of music, all these are events occurring in outer time, the time that can be measured by metronomes and clocks, that is, the time that the musician counts in order to assure the correct tempo. But to make clear why we consider inner time the very medium within which the musical flow occurs, let us imagine that the slow and the fast movement of a symphony each fill a 12-inch record. Our watches show that the playing of either record takes about 3.5 minutes. This is a fact which might possibly interest the program maker of a broadcasting station. To the beholder, it means nothing. To him, it is not true that the time he lived through while listening to the slow movement was of equal length with that which he dedicated to the fast one. While listening, he lives in a dimension of time incomparable with that which can be subdivided into homogeneous parts. The outer time is measurable. There are pieces of equal length. There are minutes and hours and the length of the groove to be traversed by the needle of the record player. There is no such yardstick for the dimension of inner time the listener lives in. There is no equality between its pieces, if pieces there were at all. Footnote. We do not need the reference to the specific experience of listening to music in order to understand the incommensurability of inner and outer time. The hand of our watch may run equally over half the dial, whether we wait before the door of a surgeon operating on a person dear to us, or whether we are having a good time in congenial company. All these are well-known facts. It may come as a complete surprise to him that the main theme of the second movement of Beethoven's Pianoforte Sonata in D minor, Opus 31, number 2, takes as much time in the mere clock sense, namely 1 minute, as the last movement of the same sonata up to the end of the exposition. Footnote. Donald Francis Tovey, Beethoven, London, New York, 1945. The preceding remarks serve to clarify the particular social relationship between composer and beholder. Although separated by hundreds of years, the latter participates with quasi-simultaneity in the former's stream of consciousness by performing with him, step by step, the ongoing articulation of his musical thought. The beholder, thus, is united with the composer by a time dimension common to both, which is nothing other than a derived form of the vivid present shared by the partners in a genuine face-to-face relation, such as prevails between speaker and listener. Footnote: this term, face-to-face relation, here and in the following paragraphs is not used in the sense that Charles Horton Cooley used it in Social Organization, New York, 1937, chapters 3 to 5. It signifies merely that the participants in such a relation share time and space while it lasts. An analysis of Cooley's concept can be found in my article, The Homecomer, in American Journal of Sociology, Volume 50, Number 5, March 1945. But is this reconstruction of a vivid present, this establishment of a quasi-simultaneity, specific to the relationship between the stream of consciousness of the composer and that of the beholder? Can it not also be found in the relationship between the reader of a letter with its writer, the student of a scientific book with its author, the high school boy who learns the demonstration of the rule of the hypotenuse with Pythagoras? Certainly, in all these cases, the single phases of the author's articulated thought are polythetically, that is, step by step, co-performed or re-performed by the recipient, and thus a quasi-simultaneity of both streams of thought takes place. The reader of a scientific book, for instance, builds up word by word the meaning of a sentence by sentence that of a paragraph by paragraph that of a chapter. But once having co-performed these polythetic steps of constituting the conceptual meaning of this sentence, paragraph, chapter, the reader may grasp the outcome of this constitutive process, the resulting conceptual meaning, in a single glance, monothetically, as Husserl puts it. Footnote: Husserl, Ideas, cited above, sections 118 and 119. That is, independently of the polythetic steps in which and by which this meaning has been constituted. In the same way, I may grasp monothetically that the meaning of the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, without restarting to perform the single mental operations of deriving it step by step from certain assured premises, and I may do so even if I have forgotten how to demonstrate the theorem. The meaning of a musical work, however, is essentially of a polythetical structure. Footnote: also of other time objects such as dance or poetry. See footnote 22. It cannot be grasped monothetically. It consists in the articulated, step-by-step occurrence in inner time in the very polythetic constitutional process itself. I may give a name to a specific piece of music, calling it Moonlight Sonata or Ninth Symphony. I may even say these were variations with a finale in the form of a Passacaglia, or characterize, as certain program notes are prone to do, the particular mood or emotion this piece of music is supposed to have evoked in me. But the musical content itself, its very meaning, can be grasped merely by re-immersing oneself in the ongoing flux, by reproducing thus the articulated musical occurrence as it unfolds in polythetic steps in inner time, a process itself belonging to the dimension of inner time. And it will take as much time to reconstitute the work in recollection as to experience it for the first time. In both cases, I have to re-establish the quasi-simultaneity of my stream of consciousness with that of the composer described herein before. Footnote: this thesis is simply a corollary to the other, that the meaning context of music is not related to a conceptual scheme. A poem, for instance, may also have a conceptual content, and this, of course, may be grasped monothetically. I can tell in one or two sentences the story of the ancient mariner, and in fact this is done in the author's gloss. But insofar as the poetical meaning of Coleridge's poem surpasses the conceptual meaning, that is, insofar as it is poetry, I can only bring it before my mind by reciting or reading it from beginning to end. We have, therefore, the following situation. Two series of events in inner time, one belonging to the stream of consciousness of the composer, the other to the stream of consciousness of the beholder, are lived through in simultaneity, which simultaneity is created by the ongoing flux of the musical process. It is the thesis of the present paper that this sharing of the other's flux of experiences in inner time, this living through a vivid present in common, constitutes what we called in our introductory paragraphs the mutual tuning-in relationship, the experience of the we, which is at the foundation of all possible communication. The peculiarity of the musical process of communication consists in the essentially polythetic character of the communicated content. That is to say, in the fact that both the flux of the musical events and the activities by which they are communicated belong to the dimension of inner time. This statement seems to hold good for any kind of music. There is, however, one kind of music, the polyphonic music of the Western world, which has the magic power of realizing by its specific musical means the possibility of living simultaneously in two or more fluxes of events. In polyphonic writing, each voice has its particular meaning. Each represents a series of, so to speak, autarkic musical events. But this flux is designed to roll on in simultaneity with other series of musical events, not less autarkic in themselves, but coexisting with the former, and combining with them by this very simultaneity into a new, meaningful arrangement. Footnote. See, for instance, the Brahms song Wir wandelten, wir zwei zusammen, in the introduction of which the walking together of the two lovers is expressed by the specific musical means of a canon, or the same device used in the credo of Bach's B minor Mass for expressing the mystery of the Trinity, et in unum. So far, we have investigated the social relationship between composer and beholder. What we have found to be the outstanding feature of musical communication, that is, the sharing of the ongoing flux of the musical content, holds good whether this process occurs merely in the beholder's recollection, or through his reading of the score, or with the help of audible sounds. Footnote. In this connection, one recalls Brahms's dictum, "If I want to listen to a fine performance of Don Giovanni, I light a good cigar and stretch out on my sofa." To believe that the visible signs of musical notation are essential to this process is no more erroneous than to assert, as even Husserl does, that a symphony exists merely in its performance by an orchestra. To be sure, the participation in the process of musical communication by means other than audible sounds requires either a certain natural gift or special training on the part of the beholder. It is the eminent social function of the performer, the singer or player of an instrument, to be the intermediary between composer and listener. By his recreation of the musical process, the performer partakes in the stream of consciousness of the composer as well as of the listener. He thereby enables the latter to become immersed in the particular articulation of the flux of inner time, which is the specific meaning of the piece of music in question. It is of no great importance whether performer and listener share together a vivid present in face-to-face relation, or whether through the interposition of mechanical devices, such as records, only a quasi-simultaneity between the stream of consciousness of the mediator and the listener has been established. The latter case always refers to the former. The difference between the two shows merely that the relationship between performer and audience is subject to all variations of intensity, intimacy, and anonymity. This can be easily seen by imagining the audience as consisting of one single person, a small group of persons in a private room, a crowd filling a big concert hall, or the entirely unknown listeners of a radio performance or a commercially distributed record. In all these circumstances, performer and listener are tuned in to one another, are living together through the same flux, are growing older together while the musical process lasts. This statement applies not only to the 15 or 20 minutes of measurable outer time required for the performance of this particular piece of music, but primarily to the co-performance in simultaneity of the polythetic steps by which the musical content articulates itself in inner time. Since, however, all performance as an act of communication is based upon a series of events in the outer world, in our case the flux of audible sounds, it can be said that the social relationship between performer and listener is founded upon the common experience of living simultaneously in several dimensions of time. 5. The same situation, the pluridimensionality of time simultaneously lived through by man and fellow man, occurs in the relationship between two or more individuals making music together, which we are now prepared to investigate. If we accept Max Weber's famous definition, according to which a social relationship is the conduct of a plurality of persons which, according to their subjective meaning, are mutually concerned with each other and oriented by virtue of this fact, then both the relationship prevailing between intermediary and listener and that prevailing between co-performers fall under this definition. But there is an important difference between them. The listener's co-performing of the polythetic steps in which the musical content unfolds is merely an internal activity, although as an action involving the action of others and being oriented by them in its course, undoubtedly a social action within Weber's definition. The co-performers, let us say a soloist accompanied by a keyboard instrument, have to execute activities gearing into the outer world and thus occurring in spatialized outer time. Consequently, each co-performer's action is oriented not only by the composer's thought and his relationship to the audience, but also reciprocally by the experiences in inner and outer time of his fellow performer. Technically, each of them finds in the music sheet before him only that portion of the musical content which the composer has assigned to his instrument for translation into sound. Each of them has, therefore, to take into account what the other has to execute in simultaneity. He has not only to interpret his own part, which as such remains necessarily fragmentary, but he has also to anticipate the other player's interpretation of his, the other's part, and, even more, the other's anticipation of his own execution. Either's freedom of interpreting the composer's thought is restrained by the freedom granted to the other. Either has to foresee by listening to the other, by protensions and anticipations, any turn the other's interpretation may take, and has to be prepared at any time to be leader or follower. Both share not only the inner durée in which the content of the music played actualizes itself, each simultaneously shares in vivid present the other's stream of consciousness in immediacy. This is possible because making music together occurs in a true face-to-face relationship, inasmuch as the participants are sharing not only a section of time, but also a sector of space. The other's facial expressions, his gestures and handling his instrument, in short, all the activities of performing, gear into the outer world and can be grasped by the partner in immediacy. Even if performed without communicative intent, these activities are interpreted by him as indications of what the other is going to do, and therefore as suggestions or even commands for his own behavior. Any chamber musician knows how disturbing an arrangement that prevents the co-performers from seeing each other can be. Moreover, all the activities of performing occur in outer time, the time which can be measured by counting, or the metronome, or the beat of the conductor's baton. The co-performers may have recourse to these devices when, for one reason or another, the flux of inner time in which the musical content unfolds has been interrupted. Such a close face-to-face relationship can be established in immediacy only among a small number of co-performers. Where a larger number of executants is required, one of them, a song leader, concertmaster, or continuo player, has to assume the leadership, that is, to establish with each of the performers the contact which they are unable to find with one another in immediacy. Or, a non-executant, the conductor, has to assume this function. He does so by action in the outer world and his evocative gestures into which he translates the musical events going on in inner time, replace for each performer the immediate grasping of the expressive activities of all his co-performers. Our analysis of making music together has been restricted to what Halbwachs calls the musician's music. Yet there is in principle no difference between the performance of a modern orchestra or chorus and people sitting around a campfire and singing to the strumming of a guitar, or a congregation singing hymns under the leadership of the organ. And there is no difference in principle between the performance of a string quartet and the improvisations at a jam session of accomplished jazz players. These examples simply give additional support to our thesis that the system of musical notation is merely a technical device and accidental to the social relationship prevailing among the performers. This social relationship is founded upon the partaking in common of different dimensions of time simultaneously lived through by the participants. On the other hand, there is the inner time in which the flux of the musical events unfolds, a dimension in which each performer recreates in polythetic steps the musical thought of the eventually anonymous composer, and by which he is also connected with the listener. On the other, making music together is an event in outer time, presupposing also a face-to-face relationship that is a community of space, and it is this dimension which unifies the fluxes of inner time and warrants their synchronization into a vivid present. 6. At the beginning of this paper, the hope was expressed that the analysis of the social relationship involved in making music together might contribute to a clarification of the tuning-in relationship and the process of communication as such. It appears that all possible communication presupposes a mutual tuning-in relationship between the communicator and the addressee of the communication. This relationship is established by the reciprocal sharing of the other's flux of experiences in inner time, by living through a vivid present together, by experiencing this togetherness as a we. Only within this experience does the other's conduct become meaningful to the partner tuned in on him. That is, the other's body and its movements can be and are interpreted as a field of expression of events within his inner life. Yet not everything that is interpreted by the partner as an expression of an event in the other's inner life is meant by the other to express, that is, to communicate to the partner, such an event. Facial expressions, gait, posture, ways of handling tools and instruments without communicative intent are examples of such a situation. The process of communication proper is bound to an occurrence in the outer world, which has the structure of a series of events polythetically built up in outer time. This series of events is intended by the communicator as a scheme of expression open to adequate interpretation by the addressee. Its very polythetic character warrants the simultaneity of the ongoing flux of the communicator's experiences in inner time with the occurrences in the outer world, as well as the simultaneity of these polythetic occurrences in the outer world with the addressee's interpreting experiences in inner time. Communicating with one another presupposes, therefore, the simultaneous partaking of the partners in various dimensions of outer and inner time, in short, in growing older together. This seems to be valid for all kinds of communication, the essentially polythetic ones as well as those conveying meaning in conceptual terms, that is, those in which the result of the communicative process can be grasped monothetically. It is hardly necessary to point out that the remarks in the preceding paragraph refer to communication within the face-to-face relationship. It can, however, be shown that all the other forms of possible communication can be explained as derived from this paramount situation. But this, as well as the elaboration of the theory of the tuning-in relationship, must be reserved for another occasion.